Now, finally, we have the speech of David Haigh, CEO of Detained International and member in the Association of Victims of Torture in United Arab Emirates, to talk about unfair trials. You're welcome, Mr. David.
Hi, good afternoon. Firstly, thank you to all my fellow panelists for what has been, I think, a very important discussion, and thank you to the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights for organising it. I'm going to talk briefly about fair trials in the UAE, or rather the complete absence of them, especially as it relates to Emirati prisoners of conscience, but also as it relates to expats, as I believe, as I will set out going forward, that that's through the publicity of expat unfair trials that we may be able to bring change to the treatment of Emirati prisoners of conscience. I speak to you today from personal experience of unfair trials in the UAE, having spent 22 months of my life subjected to them, where I was set up and held in arbitrary detention for 15 months for so-called breach of trust and a further 5 months for so-called Twitter abuse. During that detention, I met many Emirati prisoners. I also speak from my experience of helping others suffering injustice and abuse in the UAE, whether they be Emirati prisoners of conscience, expats, or the Dubai ruler's daughter, Princess Latifa. To start, though, I wanted to have a quick look at what are fair trials. And if we look at Article 10, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it clearly states that everyone is entitled in full equality to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. Article 11 goes on to state that everyone has the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty, according to law, in a public trial at which he has had all the guarantees necessary for his defence. Now, what evidence is there that the UAE does not have fair trials? Well, I'm sure the esteemed organisations of the panel all concur on this point. So to take some evidence from bodies that are not here today, in 2019, the Freedom House report concluded that the UAE judiciary is not independent, with court rulings subject to review by the political leadership, judges being appointed by executive decree, and the judiciary is an institution managed by those executive officials. They found that many judges are foreigners working on short-term contracts. They found that detainees are often detained without adequate access to legal counsel during interrogations, if any access, with lengthy detentions without charge not being uncommon. Judges are empowered to extend such detention indefinitely, and they discussed in detail the mass trial of UAE 94, which has been widely criticised for the systematic violations of international due process standards. In 2016, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture found credible evidence of torture in UAE custody. A recent US State Department country report found that all courts lacked full independence and there was no functional separation between the executive and judicial branches. If we move now to what the UK courts have found on UAE trials, a well-known extradition case in the name of Lodi set English High Court precedent when it held that there was a real risk of unfair trials in UAE courts and that English courts could not extradite British citizens to the UAE. A more recent 2017 Scottish extradition case found that a Scottish grandfather could not be extradited to the UAE, also on grounds of real risk of an unfair trial in the UAE. I'll come back to that case in a moment. In my own case, not only was I held in arbitrary detention and horrendous conditions, I was abused and tortured. When it came to the so-called trial, I would either not be taken to the court, often not allowed in the court if I was actually taken. If I was allowed in the court, I couldn't speak. There was certainly no translator in the so-called hearing, which would last minutes, and the prosecutor would be sitting right next to the judge. So if the UAE treats a high-profile expat in this way, the horrors meted out to Emirati prisoners of conscience are unthinkable. My experiences of UAE unfair trials and detention was detailed in the Scottish case I just mentioned. I'd like to share with you some of the important findings of that UK judge, a Sheriff T UAE trials and their detention system, because they're largely unreported. The case is known as the Lord Advocate for the government of the United Arab Emirates versus Garnet Black. I provided evidence over 2 days for the defence, seeking to prevent the extradition of the Scottish grandfather. I was cross-examined by UAE lawyers. The Scottish judge concluded that there was a real risk of unfair trials in the UAE, that high-ranking Emiratis have influence over and access to the police and judicial system and other aspects of civil society. He concluded in relation to my evidence that he had no doubt that I was telling the truth about seeing a civilian lawyer who acted for his former employers in Dubai police station, the company of a police officer, pointing at him before being questioned and beaten by the police. The clear inference that the civilian lawyer had influence as to how he was badly treated and abused is irresistible, the judge said. He said that he fully accepted that I was repeatedly seriously assaulted by Dubai police officers and tasered while detained, that he accepts that I was interrogated and forced to sign a document in Arabic I didn't understand. He believed my account of squalid, overcrowded and insanitary detention conditions in Dubai police station, and further believed he was sexually assaulted and raped in the car park of that police station during his detention. And he was also satisfied that the evidence I gave about poor consular access and no consular protection while in custody is true. Those are very, very damning findings against the UAE judiciary and detention system. There are literally thousands of other cases that evidence the UAE's cowboy approach to justice and trials. A week doesn't pass in the UK when UAE courts hit the headlines for their abuse of someone. And perhaps it is this publicity of expat cases and fleeing Emirati princesses that will help bring change to the treatment of Emirati prisoners of conscience, as it is these cases that put the UAE system under the world's microscope. All of us here probably know all of this already. It won't come as a surprise to any of us that everyday Emirati prisoners of conscience, even Dubai's ruler's daughter, Sheikha Latifa Shamsa, his wife, Princess Haigh, as well as expats, are all suffering from UAE's rough justice and human rights abuses. But what can we, the international community, do to bring a halt to unfair trials? There is, however, one thing I want to touch on briefly today, and that has gone somewhat under the radar in the UAE justice system. And I do so as I believe it offers the international community a route to apply pressure to seek change on abuse and detention of Emirati human rights defenders and to change unfair trials in the UAE. And I'm sure that's something we all want to see. Imagine I gave you the choice of being arrested in the UK or in the UAE. Which of those two countries would you be more confident to deal with your case fairly? I'm sure we would all here thinking that it would be the UK. But what if I now told you that you were in fact in custody in the UAE and your case was being heard by a judiciary in the UAE staffed by UK judges? That would probably make you feel okay because you would think that it would be fair. Unbeknown to many people in the world, Dubai and Abu Dhabi hire countless judges from the UK court, some of whom are even sitting both in the UK courts and the UAE courts at the same time. They do this to buy the UAE judiciary a respectability it does not warrant. It enables the UAE to launder its abuse of Emirati prisoners of conscience and its unjust legal system with the respectability of British justice. But it's tin pot justice. It just happens to be meted out by esteemed UK judges earning a bit of money for old rope in their retirement. As just some of the 20 current examples, Lord David Hope, Scotland's former top judge and ex-deputy president of the UK Supreme Court, is in charge of Abu Dhabi's commercial court. Another judge, Lord McGee, is also in Abu Dhabi's commercial court at the same time as sitting in the Court of Session in Edinburgh. Sir Jeremy Cook, the former head of the commercial court in England, sits in the DIFC Dubai's commercial court. This is the respectability the UAE is buying. UK judges on the payroll of the UAE, part of Emirati ministries of justice, working alongside judges administering UAE's arbitrary treatment and abuse of its people, who are uncomfortable to the regime, but playing by the UAE rules. The judge that jailed Ahmed Mansour is quite possibly, as we speak, sitting on a UAE Joint Judicial Committee with the former head of the English Commercial Court discussing UAE courts and trials. I highlight this now as this is one area where we, the international community, can apply pressure for change to call for the release of Emirati prisoners of conscience. The UAE judiciary may be accountable to no one but their rulers. The UK judges that staff its court still can be held to account in the UK. It's time, I think, for the UK judges that sit in the UAE courts to either seek immediate investigation and change the grave human rights abuses and use of unfair trials in the UAE judiciary in which they sit, or it's time and to call for the release of Emirati prisoners of conscience, or otherwise they must resign their well-paid Emirati judicial positions. To conclude, no one should be surprised that the UAE is a hotbed of unfair trials and human rights abuses. When you dine in the UAE, it's fair to say that you supped with the devil. The only surprise, I think, for all of us is that the devil's assistants are English judges. So that concludes what I would like to discuss on unfair trials. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In my name and the name of the Gulf Center, the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, I thank you all for your valuable participation. And we hope that this conference will achieve its goals and thus stand and support all detainees in the Gulf prisons. I also thank all viewers and followers, and we will be with you at our last session tomorrow at the same time. Follow us. Thank you so much.